Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode. I'm joined by Ben Newton, who is the CEO and founder of CareFlow IQ. That's interesting. Ben and I go back a few ways, and I've always been very impressed with his technical brilliance. So it's great to have him on the show. How are you today, Ben?
Good. You're just starting right off by buttering me up. I like it.
Great. Well, let's get started here. Maybe just to explain a little bit about what your company does, Ben. And also, I know you've had a journey with it, including an acquisition, which is really exciting. And just maybe tell us, in a few minutes, your story.
Yeah, sure. Well, starting with what we do, I mean, we're a clinical data company. Fundamentally, our mission is to really unlock data, clinical data, like so let's say data about patients, if we want to be specific, that's been locked in, legacy formats, silos, is spread, is discombobulated, all over the place, and it's unusable in most of its, forms. We can talk more about that, but our mission is really turn that into something that's accessible, actionable, and is going to, drive care forward. And that's what we've always been about. And we were started in 2021. Co-founded it with myself and John Clark as our CTO. And then we were acquired by Milliman last year. And so we're functioning with Milliman. It's basically like an independent business unit, but we're still doing the same thing, except now we have access to like a bigger family at Milliman, but we're still trying to solve that clinical data story, which I think is going to be that's a never ending story.
I talk to founders every day. I talk to founders, and that is just so critically important to all sorts of different aspects of what they do. So it's a good place to be.
Yeah, and you just got so many interconnecting elements between policy and security and government, federal, state. There's just so many different elements that wind into healthcare data that don't necessarily exist in other other areas of data that it makes it both interesting and frustrating sometimes. But I mean, the value that you can provide at the end of the day is something I've never seen before in anything else I've done.
Yeah. So tell me about the inspiration behind choosing this path, because I know you've always been in the tech world. This seems maybe a little, well, actually, when I think about what you did, maybe there's parallels, but just tell us a little bit about your
Well,
inspiration.
well, the funny thing is, the further we go, the more it seems like what I used to do. So
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
that's
Now that you mention it, right? Yeah.
yeah. We're fundamentally, I'd been with a company called Sumo Logic. It was
Yeah.
a great journey, and spent some time at Amazon, and I was trying to think about the next thing to do. And my brother, who at that point was working for what's called a federally qualified health center, so it's basically, in his case, it was a rural community clinic. What it is, it's really the only real primary care option that's local to these rural communities. And I knew that he'd been doing that. He'd done it a couple different places, and we just moved nearby. And he said, like, just come and hang out, to see what we're doing. He'd always been trying to convince me there was something to do in healthcare, and so I went, and for 3 months, just like free consulting, essentially, I went in and just listened to them. I interviewed a bunch of people, kind of said what was going on, kind of told them what I was seeing, but what, with the whole idea that maybe is there a problem I can solve here? And I wouldn't necessarily said it so concisely back then, but it really came down to a data problem. Because what I was seeing is that they're swimming in data, but very little is being used to make the staff, the doctors, the patients' lives easier. So I knew that that's something that we could solve, or at least that's something we could build a solution around. And so then you rewind a little bit. John and I have known each other for years and years. We met when we were both in California, and he had been part of a company called Glimpse that was one of the first personal health record companies.
Hmm.
So, and they found out, as most personal health records companies find out eventually, that patients don't want to pay for their data no matter how much you think they do. But what they did is they built a really cool solution to go and essentially scrape electronic health record systems, bring it back and build a record. And it worked well enough that Apple was like, hey, we want that. And they bought them. A lot of people don't notice, but like your iPhone can go grab your records.
Huh.
And they built a lot of that, and they did some cool stuff with looking at, medication interaction, like you can scan your medication bottles from the pharmacy, and did some really really cool stuff. But fundamentally, John had always wanted to work on this problem of trying to pull stuff out of these raw medical records. So, long story short, we had been talking. When I told him that I wanted to start a company, I was able to convince him to leave Apple, and we started working on that together. And fundamentally, what we were trying to do was really get at that problem of pulling this data that's been in these legacy formats and turn it into something that's useful, which is it often in startups turned out to be a much more difficult problem than we realize. But that's your competitive edge, right? If it was easy, everybody would be doing it.
Sure, sure. Just tell us then a little bit about like who's your customer? How do they interact with your system? What's the user experience? Tell us about the stakeholders and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, as you do in any startup, we tried to focus, we came early on. We actually thought we'd start off with community clinics, but what we realized is that anytime when you were dealing with insurance, Medicaid, Medicare, a lot of these other things, there's all these other elements that play into things that really aren't a data problem. They're more of a process regulatory problem. And we got introduced. The funny thing is, we both got introduced to direct primary care. Fell in love with it for our family. Like we started using it for our family. So direct primary care is basically a subscription-based primary care system. It's like now my family, I pay a certain amount per month, and we get unlimited primary care. We like the model, but then what we realized is I got to know some of these doctors better. Is they're basically doctor startups. They're
Mm,
doctor entrepreneurs, and so they are willing to go out on a limb and try something because they're not bound up in the insurance system, and they have a system, the kind of pricing system that we would understand coming from SaaS. It's like, hey, I have a subscription, I expect this amount of money to come in per patient, and then my profit margin is this, and I can allocate this much to technology. Now I can sit down and say, it's like, okay, of that money, how much are you willing to put towards solving your data problem? And that's exactly what we did. So we went in and said, okay, let's solve that data problem for you. And it really comes down to onboarding new patients and trying to understand that patient quick. Because what happens is with any provider, any particularly primary care, when they first see you, you signed something documents that you've signed and filled out in like how many different times in your life, right? And unfortunately, what tends to happen is they go then take that and they send 15 faxes
right.
in 2024, right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
still doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so and then that comes back, they don't get all the responses. They may have to, if they're willing to spend the time and the money, they're going to go call these guys up, and they're still not going to get you a whole record. And what we had found was that there were these networks that were created in the late 2010s. So Epic created Care Quality, Cerner, Athena Health, and a bunch of others created Commonwealth, and then state and local governments, the HAEs and stuff like that. They created eHealth Exchange, and they were there for the integrating with is like if you working with a provider, you can take a patient's information, go ask, say, hey, do any of these other healthcare providers, these hospitals, HAs, what are they, do you have the records? Bring it back. And these guys are still faxing.
Well, yeah.
So you would see the opportunity there. Now, but we can talk a little bit more about it, but the reality is that data is really messy. But the bottom line is that we had an opportunity to take this data that we could go out in minutes and get all these records and basically give them what they want. So it's basically say, I want to describe this patient to you, what's their story, what's their background, are there care gaps? You need to know, like, are they a type 1 diabetic? Are they managing their type 1 diabetes or their type 2 diabetes well? If they had past surgery? Those are all the things that doctors are going to ask. So if we can give that to them in a nice package with a bow,
Sure.
they're spending time with the patient, understanding how they can treat them,
Yeah.
as opposed to that. And you can imagine that then that's to a certain extent, we have applicability to every provider, in existence to some extent, because they all need that.
Yeah.
But what we tried to do is we've tried to follow the parts of the market where they're willing to innovate. And what we've seen is that the parts of healthcare that are growing really fast and are willing to experiment to increase that growth. So one of them was direct primary care. We've also seen a really nice confluence around self-funded employers, the
Mm,
health plans that they interact with, and then what essentially sometimes direct primary care or on-site providers, where they're trying to provide a more customized solution for their employees. So now you have where the people that with the money are right there. They want to get better value for their dollar. They want better care for their employees and their families. And the people that are delivering that care are right there. So if you can hit that intersection, now I have a real opportunity to basically help them deliver better care, measure that care,
yeah.
report on that care back to the people that are paying the bills. And you don't often see that all together in one place. So we found a lot of success for that. But part of the thing is now that we're part of Milliman, we are definitely being pulled into other areas. And that's part of being a platform, is like we are, some of those we're doing ourselves, but we are also working with insurance on the life insurance side, and working with ACOs on the value-based care side, but we're actually delivering those solutions through somebody else too. So it's not just us. We also enable, our partners to deliver those solutions, internal, middle, and external.
So the data that you mentioned, Ben, that was locked up in these systems from 2010. Like, are they still being populated? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, and it gets very confusing, and unfortunately, like any data person, so I've been doing this for since the early 2000s.
Yeah.
It's what I love to do. And is really trying to figure out how to take messy data and turn it into something useful. And you look at the system in healthcare in the US and you want to beat your head against the wall because it's so many inefficiencies that are driven primarily by policy. It's not really even security issues. It's more driven by policy and misplaced incentives
Wow.
where you like the people that own the data are not really incentivized to share the data, right? And you can understand why. So what you have is you have individual electronic health record systems that are running at a provider at a hospital, at wherever it is, and they have their own little pool of data. And then you have somebody else over here that has their own little pool of data. And then you would expect if you're a data person, you're like, why can't these guys just talk to each other? Now the reality is they kind of can,
Oh,
but the way that they do it is often incredibly inefficient because without getting into too much of the details, there's healthcare is full of modern data formats and ways to do this. But the reality is that to play it safe and to basically know that you're going to be able to communicate with these other entities, they're using 30-year-old formats. So what happens fundamentally when we go to these networks, the networks say, hey, you must share data. Well, all these EHRs out there, what they're effectively doing is saying, okay, well, we are mandated by the federal government to use HL7, like this older standard, and that's what you're going to give you. So when we go ask for data, and we get it say from like Duke Hospital here, or like UNC, healthcare, or wherever it is, or on the other side of the U.S., we are typically getting a combination of this 30-year-old XML format, a bunch of PDFs, faxes, all that kind of stuff. Now the reality is that if you want to spend the time, I could go make a deal with an individual hospital and like say, hey, give me your high quality data, but I'm not gonna, that's a huge amount of effort. So the best way to get a really good record is to go through these networks, but they're using ancient data formats. So that's essentially what we do is we get a pile of stuff that is not particularly usable. And if you look at the way most people deal with it, is they either just drop it on the floor or they dump it into a folder in the patient chart. No one ever
yeah.
looks at it. And
Yeah.
so it gets wasted.
Yeah. So that's your value proposition.
Yes. Exactly, because the first part of the value proposition is like, okay, you have a gold mine of data that you could be using to drive better care, but you can't use it because of all these reasons I just said. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those older formats, all of them, we're going to translate them into a modern format and do as faithful translation as we can. Now that sounds like it should be easy, but it's not because reality is the formats, unfortunately, there's a lot of reasons why, but mainly because of just humanity. They change from state to state. They change from hospital to hospital. They change from electronic health record system to electronic health record system. It's like every single time we get a new customer in a different place, it's slightly different. Like we just got on a customer in San Antonio, and now we were dealing with a local army base that use a completely different format than anybody else. So our job then is to interpret those formats and pull those in, and they're all over the place. Plus, what you find is that in healthcare, it's the data that's being transmitted is not meant to communicate the health of a patient. That's
Mm,
an important thing to understand.
mm,
Is if there's really like two big groups that we deal with. There's one is that claims data, and so that's basically the data that gets moved around for billing, right? So it's to say, hey, we did this procedure, you sent it to an insurance company, you hope the insurance company pays for it. The reality is that's very clean data, but it's very biased against getting money for procedures, and it
mm.
often is not really representing the patient. And then if you look at what's coming from the healthcare systems, from the hospitals, from the providers, whoever it is, electronic health record systems are not built to understand patients.
Huh,
They are built to run practices.
huh.
And you can understand why, right? So they help you understand the patient, but they're not built for that. So functionally, what you are getting from these places is not only patient data, you are getting operational data, you are getting bits and pieces in there that are meant to accomplish a completely different objective. So what happens is we not only have to do the conversion, we have to do sometimes what is kind of a value-based exercise where we're trying to pick out the nuggets of gold that are buried in there. And it can be very difficult. And then on top of that, you got the fact that there's typos, it's not consistent, the time scales, like all these different things, right? So there's a big job to do that. And one of the reasons why we do that better is because we start with the messy data. Like we just embrace it. We're like, We're all in. We're not going to, because if you're building a new system as an engineer, unfortunately, you went and looked at it and you said, okay, give me some sample data. It's like, no, system to sample data is not representative whatsoever of the real world. Like
Wow.
it's not at all, right?
Wow.
And so you have to start with the ugly stuff. And that means you have to have relationships with providers. You need to have, business associate agreements as part of HIPAA, like all this stuff you have to do, and you finally get the data, and that's what we build our system off of. But once we've done that translation, now the problem is like, say my record. I'm not a particularly sick guy or anything, but I've got hundreds of documents that
Yeah.
belong to my record. If you got someone that's got cancer or congestive heart failure or even type 1 diabetes or something, they'll potentially have thousands of documents that could translate into hundreds of thousands of data points.
Wow.
Now, what do you do with it, right? So now you get into the problem of like, okay, because there is some level of sharing, you will see the same data being duplicated across nearby health systems. That's one thing you'll see. And then the other piece you'll see is, once I know that, this guy over here has type 1 diabetes, I don't need to be told that 30 more times.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
the way the records are, because they're not describing the health of a patient, they're describing episodes,
Right.
right?
Right.
So we have to consolidate that because we want a single record that's describing that patient. And then you have to say, okay, now that I've got this really nice clean record, that's where the fun part starts on, in my opinion. It's like now we can say, okay, I've got a record that describes to me a bunch of data points on labs and vitals. Well, let's turn that into a time series and see what it tells us.
Right.
Let's start to identify care gaps, and that's where the you see the value that actually delivers distinct value to a provider, that we can go in there and say, hey, we found these things, we're seeing these trends, we're seeing these things that you need to know about, and you make the decision as a provider. But to do all of that, you got to put in the hard work in front of that. And that's
Right.
what's missing today in most systems, because they either don't know or don't have the time or don't want to put in the effort to actually do that hard work. And you have to.
Well, again, I think what's really interesting, especially as AI, right, becomes popularized,
Hmm.
whatever. I mean, if you're trying to build an AI solution, it really starts with quality data, right? I mean,
Yeah, if you don't have quality data, the rest is a waste of time.
yeah.
And it's not just AI. It's like, because anybody come from data, I have these conversations all the time. As you come from like a data science perspective, like what is AI? But really, at the end of the day, we're talking. So you have machine learning or large language models, whatever it is. Their conclusions are only as good as the source data you give them,
Yeah.
right? And the problem and that's one problem. And the other piece that we've run into, because we both to a certain extent, John and I come from data science backgrounds, that and he is like the full-on data scientist. And when we look at that, not only do we care about the quality of the data, but we also have to explain how we come to our conclusions. Because the problem with these kind of generic LLMs or generic algorithms in general, they can't tell you why they came up with what they did. They can say
Right.
where they got it from.
Right.
They can't tell you why. So a big part of healthcare is if you give some sort of like nugget of information to a doctor and you can't tell them why you came up with
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
then why would they ever trust it, right? So a big part of what we did was traceability.
Yeah.
In other words, like anytime we tell you that, hey, this person has diabetes or this person is dealing with this, or we're seeing these care gaps, we're going to tell you every single document, literally that we can tell you down to the line of the document we got it from, depending on how you want to look at it. And that's really, really important for being able to say, because sometimes what's going to happen, and this does happen, is sometimes there are mistakes in the record.
Right.
Like one of my one person on my team who runs our kind of clinical operations, she always talks about she's a type 1 diabetic, but she's got a type 2 diabetic diagnosis in her record.
Yeah.
That's incorrect.
Yeah.
So you get into this interesting situation too, is that how do you think about inaccuracies in records? And that's why like just throwing algorithms at the data is never a good idea. You got to be very tight in what you're trying to do, and be as sophisticated in terms of picking out the problem. So a lot of the ways that we're applying machine learning and AI is not just these generic ways. We're saying, hey, how do we figure out if this person is an actual smoker?
Right.
Or how do we figure out if this person is not only a diabetic, are they managing their diabetes? And when you're focused like that, you end up coming up with a lot higher quality output.
Right. Right. What about from a regulatory perspective, Ben? Is it right? I mean, I'm sure there's certain privacy and HIPAA and whatnot, but other regulatory kind of issues or that whatever come into play for you?
Well, you're asking questions because you know there are. But yeah, and I wish it was only regulatory. That's the funny thing. If it was
Right.
only regulatory, our job would be easier. But what you have is you have regulatory, political, and you also have the fact that these mechanisms that we use to get data have their own rules. So let me be specific. So with regulatory, anytime you're dealing with healthcare data, and I dealt with this some before in other companies I worked for. Like anytime you're dealing with, you get into HIPAA, you're dealing with business associate agreements, certain. But the reality is, if we're honest with ourselves, HIPAA is not particularly stringent if you compare it to other things. Like you really are going to end up doing like SOC 2, or you're going to do other more sophisticated security because HIPAA is not nearly as sophisticated as it should be.
Right.
So we've always found that we're going beyond that. So actually, fundamentally trying to follow HIPAA, if you really think about security more, and we're obsessed with security, that's not going to be that hard to meet HIPAA. Where it really gets into number one is that with personal health record information, if that ever leaks, you're done.
Yeah.
Like more than anywhere else I've worked, like that is the kill shot for any healthcare company, right? So you have to be obsessed with that. So we've done lots of different things where it's very, very hard to get the data. But then when you really get at it, the things that cause us more grief are not HIPAA. It's not security, because once you do that, and if you're diligent about it, you're fine. It's the fact that, for example, the networks we go to have different rules in HIPAA.
Right.
So, for example, we cannot ask for pay, and this will blow some people's minds. If I have a patient ask me for data, I have to go different places, and I'm not going to get as good a data
Right.
because the networks we use will not serve up for insurance or patients or like all these other use cases, and it's constantly changing. So you have to navigate the fact that you have a security layer, you need to follow HIPAA, and you have to be obsessed with that. But then on top of that, you have to know that all these different network providers, call it, that you're hooking into all have their slightly different rules, and you have to make sure that you're properly handling that. And at the end of the day, it can be very complicated to actually get at data that should not be complicated. And again, I don't think it's because the data is being protected. It's more about protecting the participants
Right.
and like not wanting to share their data. Like I think if we were really concerned about sharing patient data, we'd be going at this in a very different way.
Right. Right. And so what are maybe one or two use cases now? You had mentioned, so you're going in, you're getting all sorts of dirty data, you're standardizing it, you're cleaning it up. Then how is it typically used?
Well, I think the most obvious ones with providers are going to be like onboarding. So you
Yeah.
get a new patient in. These doctors don't have time to spend hours worth of research, and the joke in with providers that you say this to any doctor, they'll get what you're saying. It's like the 100-page PDF. It's like, so you go into an appointment, it's like, seriously, you want me to read that 100-page PDF before I walk in the appointment? That's not happening. So what do? They go in and they ask the same questions, and on top of that, you know as a patient, anyone who's been to the doctor's office knows before, you're asked the same questions like 3 or 4 times. And it's like, how do you not know this?
Right.
And the reason why they don't know it is because they don't get it. So that first use case of just being able to describe a patient and help that doctor go into that appointment
Mm-hmm.
well prepared, and then
Yep.
they can spend time, and then basically they're spending more time with the patient, right?
Yep.
And you're also like not doing things. What that's helping you with is you're not going back and repeating lab just to do it.
Yep.
Your staff is not wasting time going and getting the records. You're not having to bring the patient back in again, right? So that's really kind of an efficiency thing. It's an efficiency thing and almost a patient satisfaction thing. And right on top of that is every time you go out as a patient, particularly with primary care providers, when you go to a specialist, then how do they get that data back?
Yep.
So it's a tighter use case, but it's a similar thing. Is now I could say, how do I get that? You go to the hospital. How did your provider get those details? Because you'll see it's happened to me before. I had a colonoscopy, went in my doctor. She still didn't have my colonoscopy records like 3 weeks later. And then we had to reschedule. And finally, what I had to do is go to the portal of that place, download them, and put them into
Yeah.
some chat app for my doctor. It was infuriating. And it was one
Yeah.
of the reasons why I wanted to build a tool, right? So that's going to be that's going to be a big part of it. Now, I think if you step back, then there's an analytical piece to this, because probably what we're doing right up front is we're saying, okay, can I help you take this massively complex person? We're all complex, and tell you the 5 to 10 things you need to know to give the best care
Yep.
possible, right? And then help you follow that over time. But now if you think you're running a clinic or you're running a hospital, whatever it is, you need to understand the population. So now you're starting to
Yep.
say it's like, and we see this a lot with direct primary care and on-site. It's like, okay, you just signed a deal with an employer. You now got 800 lives coming on board.
Yep.
Where do you start?
Yep.
Most of what you're going to see, they're going to start with whoever comes and signs up first, right?
Yep.
Well, wouldn't it be better if we can look at that population, look at their backgrounds, risk stratify them, like basically say, okay, who here is in most need of my help, and also who can I make the biggest impact on?
Yep.
Because it's part of like, hey, I want to go to all the people out there that have chronic diseases and need help. There's also it's like, hey, if I can go to these guys that are like 45 and about to go down that steep downhill to not so good health, maybe I can go work with them. And so this case is like, going and doing weight loss programs or or doing like handling your diabetes better, whatever it is. You can't to do that. You need to risk stratify. And then the other piece is as you then have this clinic, and we realized this early on with direct primary care is typically population health is like the kind of
Yep.
the key word there is that if you're one of these non-traditional providers, but honestly, I think it goes across the board. But how do you actually prove that you're making an impact?
Yep.
Because like one, like anecdotally, like yeah, my family goes to direct primary care and we're happier. Okay, well, what can you put a number on that? Like, how do I show that in a graph to an employer to show the money they're saving? So you need to quantify it, and typically that's done with claims. So it's all done against insurance data. But the problem is, number one, it's not accurate. It's not complete. It provides a lot of detail. It's usable, or people wouldn't be using it. But if you get into some of these places of primary care, they don't even have that data because they're not billing for potentially anything or not much, right? And then there's even in a normal primary care, there's all sorts of things that aren't billed. So what we're trying to do is say, let us build that big picture for you as a provider, quantify it, help you understand your population and understand your impact, understand how your clinic's running, but then be able to go to that employer and go to like Acme Inc. over here and say, look, I have changed the trajectory on these 15 patients that were going fast downhill. I've reduced your absenteeism. I'm keeping people in work. I'm helping keep them healthy, and I've driven down your cost by 30%.
Right.
That's where, and then that helps them get more business. So we really try to think about it. It's like individually treating the patient, but you've also got to help the practice actually be more successful because then they'll get more patients. And so a big part, and that's where we found a lot of success early on is because if you go to a hospital, they have a way of doing that already. But a
Yep.
lot of these smaller providers and these more, kind of new model providers, like they have no way of doing that today.
Right. Right. Wow. Fascinating. So this has been a great interview, Ben. I know that you got acquired by Milliman. Just tell us maybe about, I don't know, maybe two or three kind of key lessons that you've learned, whatever, building this business from the ground up, selling the business, continuing to operate it, just other good pieces of advice for other healthcare AI CEOs who are, whatever. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people they want that same sort of journey, right, that you've taken.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Well, what's the old adage is like if you ask an entrepreneur what would they've done if they know what they know now, they would say, I wouldn't have started this business. So it's like that's part of the beauty of it is that going in a little ignorant is good because you don't know what you're getting into and you also won't necessarily repeat everybody else's mistakes. But yeah, I mean it's you have to go in with open eyes and early on for me it was learning how to balance your life against the business and learning how to focus on the right things, and learning how to spend your time wisely. That was really, but then you got into like raising money was very hard when we were there. I mean, hopefully it's getting better, but it was very, very hard because I grew up in Silicon Valley of like the
Yep.
2000s and the 2010s, right? And they'd be like, here's a sack of money, go do
Yep.
something. Tell
Yep.
me, tell me when you've done it. It's not like that anymore. And I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like, look, you need to go make money and
Yep.
then you come tell us about it. But the reality is with some tools like ours, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. We need money to make money. So
Yep.
you have to be aware of that going for and knowing who to go to. And I think the interesting thing for us that we learned was I had always grown up with VC money, and there's nothing wrong with VC money. I'm not one of those people that's like one versus the other. It's like, look, these are tools to go certain directions. And VC money can be very, very good. But what we realized is that with raising the money it was very difficult. When we went with Milliman, this was not a typical sale because basically what they did is they said, hey, we'll bring you in and we are going to essentially finance you, and then you're going to be judged based on your revenue. And the amount of money that I make in the long term is based on the money that I make. And so I think a learning thing was for me is like there's other models than just go
Right.
raise money until you can't raise more money and you get acquired. Like there's also models is like how can I focus on being profitable and then use that to drive my success long term. And so I think it is a balance, but I would say that you do have to realize when you're not in New York or LA or San Francisco, it is harder. And you have to go in there knowing that. And you just have to be realistic with yourself about what you have at hand. It's not a, it's and then make decisions based on that. It's like, what's the best decision I can make for me, my team, my company right now, based on what I have, and then go for it. It's not a good or bad thing. It just is.
Right, 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 right. Wow. Well, this has been fabulous. And congratulations on your journey, Ben. I mean, you tackled a massive problem, and I think you're still wrestling with it.
We'll
But
still be tackling. Like you talk to me 10 years from now, hopefully I'll still be tackling it.
yeah, but congratulations, and
Thank you.
keep all the best of success in the future.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.